The only thing I would say very briefly is, I mean, I think it's a particular challenge for a chronic, ongoing kind of condition, which is different than a sort of acute epidemic, the way that you've described. The other thing I would say is I don't think that we should discount the progress we've made. Cancer would be a perfect example, right, where we've learned a lot through brunt empiricism because we didn't understand underlying etiology, but we tried a whole lot of different treatments first and eventually made a lot of progress.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe. Sergeant Major Walz.
Thank you, Chairman, and I thank you all for being here. I think I'll dovetail on that, Dr. Clancy. First of all, thank you for the update on the STEP pain management plan. I think it's important information with the hearing that's going to be next week up in New Hampshire with Ms. Custer that back in '07 this very issue was out there, and I think great strides were made, and I think you have much to add to the conversation because this is not a VA issue of opioid use and pain. It is a societal issue. So I appreciate that update. And I think going back to what you said, I do think you're right on that. I think much progress was made on some of these very difficult ones. Dr. Rowe clearly laid out the epidemiology and the challenge of this. My concern is, though, when do we make a decision that we've tried hard enough, or that we've reached that point? Because I think the frustration lies in this, that I think something's happening. And again, we have to have the data, but there's something happening. There's enough people reporting it. All of us are hearing this. And I just wondering, you have to make tough decisions about where funding sources go and where those types of things happen. I think there's a belief of many of us that this is going to be difficult, but we have a responsibility to keep going on it. How do you make a decision, you being the VA, if you can speak for that, how do you make a decision on how hard you push on a certain area or how much you do in the research?
So let me just say, having run a research agency for quite a few years at HHS, this is one of the toughest kinds of decisions to make, and it's really an investment question, right? Where do you place your bets in terms of getting to rapid answers and the kind of evidence that you want? And there's no biblically correct strategy in terms of rules to guide you. The one recommendation, the very top line recommendation, and I want to emphasize that we've not had a chance to go over this Institute of Medicine report. It's still, the ink is still drying, so to speak. It's actually a pre-publication version I think we're all looking at and so forth, and are looking forward to going over it with our Research Advisory Committee very, very carefully. But the notion that we would develop a cohesive, coherent plan with the Department of Defense, and frankly invite in others like the Harvard study that Dr. White referenced and so forth, to find out, to really push very hard on this question. This is a huge proportion of people who are deployed for these two operations, and we don't have any answers. We have some promising signals, and that's exciting. I think some additional genomic studies, as a paper that I'm looking at from Dr. White has pointed out, may help us even more. But that's not coming up with an answer for why are almost a third of these soldiers deployed struggling. So I think that this is going to be a tough answer to come up with and a tough strategy to come up with, but it's one that we'd be looking forward to giving you full answers on. The last thing I would say is the number I gave you is a very, very conservative estimate because it doesn't count our epidemiological studies. It doesn't count the investments we've made in registries, for example, the Gulf War Registry, the Burn Pits Registry, and so forth. And so we're investing more than that, but the question is, have we done enough? And I think the answer to that is no.
No, and I appreciate that because I do think you've got on it too the broader issue. I think many of us who have followed the issues on Agent Orange, and there's Vietnam veterans sitting in this room that have pushed on this. Sure. They're concerned on the genetic defect issue of how many generations down the line, you know, beyond spina bifida, of what's happening to these children, what's happening to the grandchildren. That's going to come to this, the burn pit, the depleted uranium. So my question is, are we doing enough? I mean, shame on us if we're not learning that every generation has to come back and fight the fights on these things. Is now the time for a center of excellence on toxic wounds? Is this the time to do that? Does that make the difference where it brings the force of all of these issues under one? Because the thing I worry about is I don't want to pit Parkinson's research on Agent Orange exposure against Gulf War exposure. And I know you may tell me that's the choices we have to make, the hard ones. So I ask you, is the Center of Excellence the way to go to bring this under one in-house?
You know, it may be, and we would love to work with you on that, because no matter what we called it, because I agree with you about the X amount here, Y amount there, who's made the most noise recently, to be crass.
Yes, no, I think that's a true statement, though.
No matter how you cut it, it's going to have to be an entity that coordinates what we're doing with defense, with what's going on at HHS, and from a variety of other funders, which would be great, actually, but I think we can leverage all of that. We've recently been working with CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Diseases on the Camp Lejeune issue, and actually that was very, very productive.
And I think our issue, especially with these toxic wound exposures in battle, it differs from cancer in that the private sector is not investing as much in this because there's not it's a limited universe that's going to be treated by this. So once we treat them, which we need to do, and cure them, there's not a market for the product necessarily.
Exactly.
That may be crass too, but that's the reality of the economics. But no, I thank you all for that, and I think the commitment here is that something happened to these folks. It's real, and they deserve an answer and a treatment. So I yield back.